Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michaela Keat, and I'm the chair of the Speakers Committee at the College of Law at the U of S. I'm pleased to welcome you to our first speaker event of this academic year, presented as part of the McKercher Lecture Series at our college. As we gather virtually today, I acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. This edition of the lecture series at the law school is being presented entirely online. And while we may not be able to gather in a physical space, we are more committed than ever to delivering a wide range of informative, educational, and entertaining speakers to the law school community and beyond this year. Before we get started, I'll quickly go over a few online housekeeping items. This lecture is being recorded and will be available online afterwards, and we invite everyone to keep their microphones muted during the course of the presentation and to present their questions in the chat after. Now, to get started, I would like to begin by thanking McKercher, the McKercher Law Firm, for sponsoring our lecture series. David Stack is a partner at the Saskatoon office, where he practices in the area of civil litigation, admin and labor law, and corporate commercial. He has recorded some welcome remarks that I'll play for you now.
McKercher LLP has had the privilege of being a proud supporter of this lecture series since its start in 2014. The decision to support the College of Law in these lectures was an easy one for us, as we understand firsthand the great job that the college does in educating and preparing successful lawyers. Education, knowledge, and innovation are crucial in securing the future success of our province. Our support for this initiative provides a catalyst for provoking thought, enhancing collaboration, and engaging future leaders. With the transition of these lectures to the virtual format, we hope that this will provide an even greater opportunity for the College of Law to enlighten and engage students, lawyers, and our community on these important topics. Stay safe, be well, and enjoy.
Today, we kick off our fall lecture series with our guest speaker, Rachel Loewen. Rachel joins the College of Law as the Ariel Sallows Chair in Human Rights for the 2021 year. Prior to this, Rachel served as the Executive Director of OUT Saskatoon for nearly 7 years. While at OUT Saskatoon, Rachel worked with leaders across Canada to develop the Enchanté Network, a national organization that works to build the capacity and reach of Two-Spirit and LGBTQ centers. Rachel currently serves as the president of the Enchanté Network's board of directors, in addition to serving on the boards of the Saskatoon Housing Initiatives Partnership and the Saskatoon Housing Authority. Rachel has a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Alberta and was the recipient of a Joseph Bombardier Doctoral Fellowship from SSHRC, the President's Doctoral Prize of Distinction, as well as a SSHRC Fellowship for her master's research. Rachel spent more than 10 years as a sessional instructor at the University of Saskatchewan and has worked in a number of research capacities, including with the Indigenous Peoples Health Research Centre, the Prairie Region Health Promotion Centre, and the Canadian Mental Health Association. Over to you, Rachel.
Hello. I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for that kind introduction, Professor Keat. And I want to also say thank you to Katie Richard for technical support and practice sessions as we prepared for this talk. So this talk today is a development of one of the chapters of my dissertation, which was called The Matter of Time, Stories from a Living Present. My dissertation brought my great love of time and my obsession with the stories that we tell together in a way that enabled me to look at things such as coming out as queer, the anticipation of climate change, marriage equality, Indigenous sovereignty in Canada, and the content of this talk here today. And as I dug through the chapter, I was worried that some of the examples were dated. But of course, as I went through, I realized that it was more timely than ever to talk about misogyny, politics, and the law. And with that, I would also be remiss not to acknowledge the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg last week, the great lover of justice and fighter for gender equality. What timing indeed. So as Professor Keat said in the intro, my background is in philosophy and community-based advocacy, thanks to my time without Saskatoon. This is a positioning that influences everything I do. So it makes me very interested in concepts such as sexism, hate, even love, as they contribute to our constructions of meaning and knowledge. And I'm wholly invested in the impacts that these concepts have on the real lives of those that live them. So for today's lecture, I'm going to dig deep into a heavy concept, the concept of misogyny. And I'm going to explain how the way that we understand terms and concepts has an effect on what they do in the world and what we can do with them. Likewise, it's through the stories that we tell. And by stories, I mean many of the mediums and sources and communication tools that we have at hand, news articles, published papers, blogs, all of those things contribute to our knowledge making. And it's through those stories that we're able to mobilize our futures and remake our pasts in ways that work toward greater justice and equity. So for the first story, politics. As we approach a whole slew of elections this fall, municipal, provincial, and of course the American election, I want to travel back to that fateful 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running for president of the United States. During this time, Clinton faced some of the most misogynist, gut-wrenching criticism that the American public, and we in Canada, America's awkward and ever-watchful step-sibling, had ever witnessed. Clinton was never treated as a viable political candidate. She was the target of every sexist spurn, every internal monologue writ large, every shameful betrayal of women's hard-won rights. Right from the beginning, she had public memory working against her. She was the dutiful wife of Bill Clinton, the unemotional political shark, a loyal confidant of Barack Obama, private email conspirator. None of these allowed an autonomous subject position. Merchandise at the Republican National Convention included buttons, t-shirts, and bags that read, and pardon my language, but we need to hear these words, "Hillary sucks, but not like Monica. Life's a bitch, don't vote for one." And KFC special, 2 fat thighs, 2 small breasts, left wing. Language like this is jarring in any context, but it was common, even celebrated amongst Trump supporters. And, as is often the case when women threaten patriarchal power, Clinton was judged primarily along the lines of gender, how well she did or did not do femininity. And so this means that the criticism shifted depending on her emotional affect. Exhibit A, on the one hand, we had the narrative that Clinton shows emotion, she's too weak to be president, a common trope used against women. And this happened all the way back in the 2008 primaries against Obama, prior to the 2015-2016 election. Clinton was chastised for welling up with tears while campaigning in New Hampshire. A reporter wrote, "Male voters are basically going to see a hysterical woman. Women are going to think that if Clinton is going to take on this responsible role and represent women in such a visible way, she should do a better job and not expose the gender to this criticism." On the other hand, we have Exhibit B. Clinton lacks emotion. She's too cold to be a woman. So in 2015, Clinton's back in New Hampshire leading a forum on the problems of drug addiction, and a woman gets up and shares the story of her son's suicide. Another reporter writes of the exchange saying that Clinton physically backed up closer to a wall as she listened and nodded. When the woman finished her story, Clinton retrieved a microphone, turned away, and began asking another panelist to respond. No real show of compassion, no hug, or even a touch on the hand. It's clear that Clinton was damned if she did and damned if she didn't. On the other hand, everyone's favorite villain, Donald Trump, repeatedly soared above his timeline. Any shameful past, present, or anticipated future mistake disappeared into thin air the instant it was invoked. It didn't matter that his PR experience centered around reality television, where characters are required to inspire extreme and competing reactions. And a New York Times reporter during this time charted a sense of invincibility that surrounded him, saying he's a savior or a disaster, a bigot or a patriot, a truth teller or a buffoon, a commanding frontrunner or a bubble on the verge of bursting. Many predicted that he would fade from the race as time went on, but somehow, unlike Clinton, the stories had a positive rather than negative impact on public opinion. And as we know now more than ever, Trump can make impossible promises for the future and the world just laughs and rolls its eyes, or worse, believes him. He can yell racist slurs from a podium and the crowds cheer him on. So there's different tools of memory, time-telling, anticipation that are acting on Clinton and Trump. Just as we're acting then, are acting now, and it shows us that each of them travel through time differently. Trump was an aberrant time traveler, able to dart through decades of bad behavior unscathed, while Clinton had no magic time-traveling wand. One tear shed in New Hampshire in front of 16 voters in 2008 haunted not one, but 2 elections. Every clear and confident speech was read as arrogant and cold. So why is it that when it came to making history, Trump had wings and Clinton had lead blocks on her feet? Of course, there are many true answers to this question, but today I'm going to zero in on the most obvious, and that is misogyny. We all know what misogyny is. It's an old term, whispered behind closed doors. It can be abrasive, and I've had it spark defensiveness when invoked in community and academic environments. Misogyny is a weighty term. It's a heavy hitter in a way that terms like sexism or even patriarchy are not. And the concept itself is affective, by which I mean that it produces bodily sensations. It invokes specters of rape, sexual assault, hate-fueled insults, practices of gaslighting. There's also a thick time to misogyny, as the word is from ancient Greece, with the etymology of miso, which means hatred, and gyne, which means woman. And it has documented presence in nearly every culture on the planet. And so, inevitably, misogyny's roots run deep within the histories of Western philosophy, sociology, psychology, law, political studies, and many other areas. And in each of these, it's generally understood to be the hatred of or contempt for women and girls. One anthropology scholar describes it as a feeling of enmity toward the female sex, a disgust or abhorrence toward women. This is how most people describe and understand misogyny, and when I went digging, I found very little that strayed from this lens. But then I found a study that went a different route. It took this well-known dusty and a bit scary concept and looked at it from another angle, and that was the book called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, written by philosopher Kate Manne. And this book, highly recommended, it flipped a switch in the way that I understood misogyny's past as well as its future. In her book, Manne talks about the fact that when she began working on the topic, she found that the word was considered a bit unfashionable, and in some circles, even positively passé. But that in the years that followed, its use grew exponentially. And I would say that I had a similar experience as I started working with the concept and exploring the time of misogyny. I used Google search tool to compare the number of searches over time, as well as the number of articles and posts that contain the word misogyny in the heading. And when I was originally conducting this research, the airwaves were thick with the talk of misogyny. Yesterday, I actually did a comparison of instances between 2005 and 2020, and it was really right at that 2016 point. December 2016 was the biggest spike in searches. It's still been on a steady incline since then, but that was the big spark. And of course, as I'll talk about later on in this lecture, that was right after Trump's election, prior to the inauguration ceremony, prior to the Women's March movement that took off around the world. And so there's a significant moment there that we'll look at later on. So why am I interested in this? Because concepts and ideas, phenomenon have lives of their own. We know that. And it also has to do with the sense in which misogyny's operation is more than we think it is. What if it's much more complicated? And this is where Manne's argument really clicked for me, because rather than sticking with the historical definition of misogyny as the hatred of women, she defines misogyny as the law enforcement branch of a patriarchal order, which has the overall function of policing and enforcing its governing norms and expectations. This definition shifts the lens from the individual misogynist who hates women to the patriarchal society in which women are controlled, punished, and policed according to whether or not they ascribe to gendered expectations. One of the big cases of misogyny in Canada is the Montreal Massacre, where Marc Le Pen murdered 14 women in a mechanical engineering classroom at École Polytechnique in a gross show against feminism. There's no doubt that the motive for this atrocity was misogyny. But if we expand the definition to be the law enforcement branch of a patriarchal society, it enables a wider reading in both the actions of individuals such as Marc Le Pen and in social systems. It shows us that the Montreal Massacre was not a singular case. It was not a rare occurrence. Instead, it was the tipping point, the last stand of discriminatory ideologies that are already deeply sustained and reinforced by our institutions and social systems. This also helps us to understand how misogyny differs from other more widely used sibling terms such as sexism, gender inequity, or even patriarchy. Take sexism. We know sexism is the discrimination of someone based on gender. It's a word that we hear a lot. And so today in social conversations, the word misogyny can quiet a room in the way that sexism cannot. Kate Mann differentiates between the two terms in claiming that sexism can be complacent, while misogyny may be anxious. Sexism has a theory. Misogyny wields a cudgel. When I vocalize misogyny in those instances where it's warranted, I feel a combined fear and defiance. It's the concurrent sense of having gone too far and having finally named the truth. And it reminds me of the concept of the feminist killjoy. Around 10 years ago was when the concept of the feminist killjoy really came into public parlance. And it's a term from Sarah Ahmed, a feminist scholar from Britain who coined the concept. The feminist killjoy is a person of any gender who speaks up and names the inequities in the world, naming racism in a hiring process, addressing sexism at the dinner table with one's family. That's what I feel when I say the word misogyny, that I feel like the feminist killjoy. And it's because this feeling is affective, because it translates as a burning sensation on the skin, a blush, nervous eye movements, shame, insecurity. We take it up in the body. And even more importantly, we all have different biographies of violence, and these are entangled with the way in which we understand the concept and the practice of misogyny. So misogyny itself is a sensation that's carried in the bodies of its targets. It contracts memories, words, leers, and traumas. Its weightiness haunts its absence. And as its use in popular media grows, so too does its application to the many experiences of women, girls, trans and non-binary people that may have had the sensation, but not the logic to name what's going on. So Kate Mann's investigation into the logic of misogyny was not only timely, it also provides a rich analytic frame for exploration of the term's temporality. And so by this I mean that misogyny recalls centuries of storytelling about women, gender, sex, and power, at the same time that it has a physical, emotional, and psychological imprint on the bodies of its targets. Whether it's a physical body, a school curriculum, a political race. By expanding the concept to indicate the enforcement arm of patriarchy, we're able to reread cases and examples from the past, stories that otherwise would not have been weighed down by misogyny's heavy hand, stories that have been told and untold in many different ways and need to be told in different ways. And so to illustrate this more explicitly, I'm going to turn to a second story that has to do with misogyny and the law. And this story is likely familiar to many of you. In fact, as I prepared for this lecture, I watched some of the other McKercher lectures. I watched particularly Marilyn Poitras's talk from a few years back, where she referenced this story, and it's the murder of Pamela George in Regina, which occurred 25 years ago. This story is told and retold regularly in many environments, of course, because it still confounds us, as many injustices do. And so on Easter weekend in 1995, two college-aged white men, Stephen Comerfield and Alex Chernowitzky, kidnapped and murdered Pamela George in Regina. The high-profile and controversial case following the murder focused heavily on Pamela George's life choices, race, and character, while praising the otherwise upstanding, reasonable, upper-class characters of the young men who committed the crime. This is a very familiar story. The two young men were sentenced to only 6.5 years in jail, and in the years that followed, many have documented the blatant racism and sexism that both contributed to the sentencing and to the murder itself. In her infamous analysis of the case, Shireen Razak reminds us that Indigenous women are spatialized. This means that their bodies are actually limited to certain places, movements, definitions, and we saw this in the court proceedings and media documentation as Pamela George was identified as a prostitute working in a particular area of town rather than any other identifying terms. The defense lawyer, the Crown attorney, and the jury all regarded her as partially responsible for her death because she chose to participate in sex work. And of this, Razak writes that, quote, "While it's certainly patriarchy that produces men whose sense of identity is achieved through the brutalizing of a woman, the men's and the court's capacity to dehumanize Pamela George derived from their understanding of her as the gendered racial other, whose degradation confirmed their own identities as white, that is, as men entitled to the land and the full benefits of citizenship." This reference to citizenship and entitlement to the land is crucial because it demonstrates the link between colonization and misogyny. Think about the way that concepts such as nation or country are often feminized, indicating bodies to be discovered and claimed. Colonial countries have been well aware, long time, that the key to assimilation is to conquer, metaphorically and literally, the colonized country's women, so as to ensure the successful development of a new nation. And it's not just the case that women's bodies are more spatially policed, so the ways in which women sit cross-legged or reservedly so as not to take up space, or men are socialized to spread out as an expression of assertiveness and self-confidence, but that space itself is deemed the feminine landscape on which the masculine constructs of culture, civilization, and reason are built. So it's no mistake that Pamela George was targeted at the intersecting axes of patriarchy and colonialism, and her story has been repeated across Canada thousands of times. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was developed precisely to collect and archive the stories of women, girls, and Two-Spirit people who have been kidnapped, murdered, and assaulted in a country that enables misogyny. I can pick up stories from 10 years ago, 2 years ago, yesterday, tomorrow. But I recount the murder of Pamela George 25 years later in order to thicken our timeline of misogyny. I want us to think about misogyny not as something one man does to one woman. Again, it's not the moment where an individual feels hatred, hostility, or similar emotions toward women simply because they are women. It is instead a system of control and punishment that stretches around a body, a family, a town, a country. And so to break this definition apart a bit more thoroughly, I want to talk about how our historical definition of misogyny is a definition that's far too narrow, while on the other hand, it's not focused enough. It's too narrow because in relying on the individual misogynist's activities and beliefs, rather than that patriarchal ideology that provides fertile ground for misogyny. So in Pamela George's case, we can see that the court's painting of Comerfield and Chernowitzky as middle-class college boys who just wanted to have some fun directed them from being away from being classed as misogynists. And I poured through the news tracking and cases around that, and that was very clear in the language that was used around them. Definitely no one was using the word misogyny. It's also too narrow of a definition, that straight line, because it restricts to a gender binary in ways that Kate Mann's definition does not. And so by this, I mean a largely unexplored terrain of misogynies in regard to queer communities, where gay male misogyny is that which is directed at anyone, gay, lesbian, pan, trans, who occupy more feminine codes of expression, while the term transmisogyny is used to refer to unique experiences of misogyny that trans, female, or feminine people experience in its intersection with transphobia. In this case, society's tremendous aversion to femininity in all aspects is acted out tenfold on trans women. And misogyny and transmisogyny can function to reinforce a particular gender and racial hierarchy that continually confines queer femininities to the status of otherness. If we only understand misogyny in a binary mode, directed at cisgender women from cisgender men, we dismiss transmisogyny. We miss the fact that it's actually the apparatus of heterosexuality and patriarchy within gay male communities that ensures the survival of misogynistic ideals by making that opposition and distancing from femininity an essential component of belonging within the community. And that is a topic of another talk entirely. So on that we have the too narrow, right? That definition, the historical definition. On the other hand, as I said, this historical definition lacks focus because in the way that it's applied to all women because they are women, rather than as particular people who engage in particular activities. This is the key to understand because it means that the misogynist, in order to be cast as such and actually sentenced as such, must demonstrate a deep and sustained hatred for all women qua women, a factor which renders it quite rare in presentation. As I said, this definition worked against Pamela George, as her murderers were never penalized for having beaten her because she was an Indigenous woman who was also a sex worker, though these subject positions were precisely what fueled the attack. If we apply this to the example of misogyny within the queer community, it shows us that it's often femininity that is misogyny's target. For some gay men, femininity represents every slur that was used against them in the schoolyard. And so masculinity and masc credentials are often coveted, and expressions of femininity are targeted and discriminated against. Furthermore, this example shows us that the ways that feminine boys and men remain a huge source of anxiety for society, as they represent both the contingency of gender and failures of a patriarchal empire to mold its men. Misogyny is a vast and far-reaching system. So understanding how misogyny works to police particular people in particular contexts gives us a new landscape of inquiry. It also requires that, again, we differentiate between sexism and misogyny, such that although the two share a mission to maintain a patriarchal order, with misogyny functioning as the enforcing branch of patriarchy, we can think of sexism as the rationalization branch. This means that sexism often operates to naturalize sex differences, make them seem inevitable, sometimes even upholding sexist hiring practices or social arrangements. It's a term we say, well, it's there, it's part of the process, we'll just figure out our way around it. With misogyny functioning within a patriarchal order, policing and enforcing women's subordination, that means that misogyny is operating to target women quite selectively within that wash of sexism. It is not at random. It is not across the board. That's the piece that we need to be very, very aware of. So circling back to the 2016 American election for a moment, it's no accident that the language was so racist, homophobic, and patriarchal, because Hillary Clinton crossed dangerous boundaries in running for president of the United States, precisely because she dared to take what Kate Mann describes as masculine-coded goods away from dominant men. These goods included power, prestige, rank, money, wealth, status. And Clinton's fault was not only her attempt to take the presidency and all of its related coding, but her seeming failure to provide feminine coded goods and services such as attention, affection, admiration, sympathy, sex, and children. She didn't even provide mixed goods such as safe haven, nurture, security, soothing, and comfort. And we saw that in those early in that news coverage around her statements. So despite the fact that female politicians are definitely common targets for misogynist aggression, women such as Clinton, who dare to take masculine-coded goods, are liable to be written off as greedy, entitled, corrupt, out of order. Again, we saw that again and again and again. And so the anxiety that Clinton caused the patriarchal order is rampant in the treatment she received from Trump, the press, other women, and even many feminists in their documentation of Clinton's run. In Pamela George's case, it was not the fact that she was taking masculine coded goods, but rather that she was all too circumscribed by Comerfield and Chernowitzky's entitlements to her feminine coded goods of affection and sex. Her presumed inability to perform her feminine coded duties, such as social, domestic, and reproductive labor, on account of her participation in sex work, provided them with the grounds for enforcement of the patriarchal order. And let's be much clearer here. For Pamela George's murder was, without question, the result of a racialized misogyny. The presence of Pamela George's murder within a national epidemic of misogyny directed toward Indigenous women and girls follows precisely from the argument that misogyny is not an individual's hatred, it is the societal policing of particular women. It does not target all women because they are women, it targets particular kinds of women. And by identifying this difference, we're able to recognize the racially motivated misogyny of attacks on Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, which in a racist society would otherwise go unrecognized. This also enables us to recognize trans misogyny as the axis of transphobia and misogyny in its targeting of trans women or femme-presenting trans and non-binary people. So, what are we to make of misogyny's future? Well, despite the fact that there is an upsurge of texts about misogyny, we are talking about it in ways that we definitely were not. Very few offer possible steps forward or backward. It still feels often as though misogyny is throwing its weight around as the concept and act that no one wants to claim responsibility for, both in its perpetration and its repair. And so I turn to a third story. And this, I'm the kind of scholar who uses what's at hand. This means that I reference blogs, news stories, children's movies that I watched the night before finishing a paper, much to the chagrin of my college professors, I'm sure. I reach for what interests me, and I think we all do. We're always already immersed in a world that's writing the stories that we're telling. And so it was Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point that got me thinking about alternative ways of engaging with misogyny. And this is a book that tells several stories about those moments when an idea or trend, concept tips over the edge and becomes a phenomenon. He uses the example of the return to popularity of hush puppy loafers. And so in 1994, I guess the company was debating going out of business. And a few hipsters in New York suddenly started wearing hush puppies again. So what this was a convergence of timing. Hush puppies were old enough to be cool again. Influence, they're being worn by these style savvy youngsters in Manhattan, and stickiness. This is a really fascinating concept to me. It's about how things lodge, we remember them, and they stood out in this classic simplicity. This meant that the company's sales skyrocketed and a whole new era of hush puppies hit the shelves. The key about The Tipping Point is that it's not causal in the sense that it cannot be planned. It's not something that the company plotted, because we can't determine when things tip, when they roll over in that way. And so this idea really made me think about the tipping point in relation to the 2017 Women's March movement, which it's estimated to have resulted in over 7 million participants worldwide. Trump's inauguration ceremony on January 20th, 2017 definitely tipped the scales as it preceded the Washington Women's March and the hundreds of concurrent marches. But the movement wasn't born of reactionary politics just to that inauguration ceremony. Instead, it was from more than a year and a half of watching the American election campaign, listening to Donald Trump espouse racist, misogynist, and homophobic ideologies on a daily basis. We were ripe and ready. The energy was in the air. It just needed to flip. Likewise, the Me Too movement was founded by Tarana Burke back in 2006 when she used the hashtag to raise awareness about sexual assault. But the movement reached a tipping point when it was used in relation to the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse allegations. We saw a tipping point this summer of a renewed Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer on camera. The significance of the tipping point is not necessarily that we're looking for an origin story. Instead, the tipping point is what Gladwell describes as the moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point, the point at which we can hold it in no longer. And it triggers to a much larger sphere of influence. And so, in a society that's obsessed with individual motives and intent, an expanded definition of misogyny is a tipping point for the recognition that we do not have a monopoly on the impacts of our actions. And so misogyny has uptake well beyond one individual, well beyond one case. Again, not isolated incidents. And so this means that we will want to ask questions such as, what is it about our culture that enables the policing and control of femininity? What is it about racism that fuels misogyny against trans women of color? It also means that when we see such gender-based violence bubble up in a person's actions, we know that it is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the signal that we should shine a light on the underlying words and deeds that are doing the enforcing work, whether these are the products of individuals or the product of government policies, international development initiatives, or online communities. In this way, we can see that Trump is both the canary in the coal mine, signaling a culture of systematic misogyny, and he is the pendulum as it swings over the edge. So to say that we're at the tipping point of misogyny is to see both that the concept is coming into much greater focus and that its enforcement contracts thousands of years of memory, stories, and terror. This encounter is also with the iceberg below the surface, as we're able to parse misogyny's jagged edges much more easily. We can see its reach throughout all arms of a patriarchal society, and its enforcement by way of foreign policy, the objectification of not just women but entire nations, the intense racism that props up in continued acts of murder and violence. This reveals, I'm sure many feel, much more than we want to see, but the process of revelation has the companion effect of unearthing misogyny's pervasiveness and making much more visible its institutionalization within Western political, social, and cultural systems. It is with this breadth that a concept of misogyny has really tipped into the public sphere. And we see this, and we need to. But I assure you, we are just dancing on the edge of its full vocalization. And this is because the concept of misogyny brings not only intersectional specificity, clarity of intent and attack, but it does bring movement. This heavy, scary word serves as a sort of tipping point for feminist movements to come. And this is no metaphor, as the Me Too movement has had concrete influence on federal budgets. A number of years ago, Canada's once starved status of women continually experiencing cuts was rebranded as the Department for Women and Gender Equality, for the first time ever fully naming a focus on the LGBTQ2 community, in addition to gender inequity, and now also has a robust new funding portfolio aimed directly at reducing and responding to gender-based violence. Much of the literature that they used for this new portfolio cites the Me Too movement as influential in this shift. And that's a significance that we do well to talk about. The ways that our social movements, our cultural conversations, they do have uptake. So, in closing, back to our enemies, our enemy Trump. But in the sense that earlier I described Clinton and Trump's timelines as static versus aberrant. As I talked about Trump having wings in the face of history while Clinton had lead blocks on her feet. And I use these references in relation to the cultural memory that we serve, where Clinton has been tied to her past actions and Trump is able to leap above accusations such as sexual assault and harassment, lying about businesses, cheating on his taxes. This effect is a bit of a temporal stickiness, where Clinton's position as a woman in a man's game ties her to her past and ties her to her body. And Trump's fluidity is thanks both to his identity position, but also to his effective refusal to let anything stick through the various very effective behaviors that he uses, such as denial, laughter, outright lying. Who knew that these were such effective strategies? This shows us that the containment of the female body is a fundamental tactic of misogyny. We see this in the language around Hillary, as news coverage framed her in relation to the various men she was alongside or up against. This positioning changed depending on the year, easily passed from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama, Donald Trump. Each one of these transfers show that she's the incidental, never the subject, never the autonomous subject. And so to view women as the passive material of culture is to limit their ability to be masters of their own fate. It's to view them as absent from the making of history. And so misogyny gains power precisely as a result of its erasure of the temporal agency of its victims, through requiring its targets to stay contained within a fixed time frame. And so it really is through the act of telling and retelling these stories, pulling apart the timelines, that we're able to stretch misogyny. We need to talk about its global reach into countries and nations, about its enforcement of sexism, its collaboration with racism, homophobia, transphobia. There are times that we need to use this weighty term in place of the more palatable gender-based violence. Misogyny needs to be differentiated from sexism. We need to explore whether neocolonialism is a misogynist enforcement of Western patriarchy, why femininity remains the other within gay male communities, and to see that violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people is fueled by a misogyny that functions because, not in spite of, because it is also a racism. A quick search of news stories demonstrated that, particularly in Britain, police and policymakers are working to view misogyny as a hate crime. They're doing some really crucial work around educating the public, educating police officers, educating communities about misogyny, that this is a hate crime, and that it's precisely what we've been talking about, that it targets particular actions in our society. It enforces a patriarchal order, and so needs to be taken up in a different way than it has been taken up in the past. This move is precisely the type of amplification that we need, as it results in stricter sentencing. It results in taking what we now talk quite widely as gender-based violence, taking it more seriously. So it's showing us we have tipped over the edge, and many offshoots are already taking place, though many more need to come. So, in calling for a time of misogyny, I hope it is time that we dust off this scary concept and we get to work on a range of legal, social, and cultural analyses in order to take very seriously both its reach and its potential for change. Thank you.
And I'm just going to say a couple of things in terms of thanking you and opening this up for some conversation now in these last 10 minutes that we have. While we couldn't see the video during the presentation, your voice and your choice of words and message were extremely impactful. And I know that we've all enjoyed listening to this presentation. Just as a note to those who aren't monitoring the chat, we will be posting a link in the days to follow here with a clear video and audio so that you can revisit this if there are parts of it that you'd like to come back to. So I'm going to open it up right now just to conversation. If anyone has a question or an observation that they'd like to make, please either put it in the chat and we'll keep an eye out, or use your electronic raise hand feature and we'll keep an eye out for that. One question, or one thing that I thought I was quite intrigued, Rachel, by the extent to which you were speaking to the events of the last couple of days and even in the United States, and your description of tipping points on this topic in the last 3 years. And I wondered if you thought that the tipping points that would have an impact would be different here in Canada than what we're seeing in the US. I think we're all hoping that we're in the midst of yet another tipping point in terms of the American context. But what are your thoughts about how that translates to the Canadian political landscape?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not a political expert by any means, but in the ways that I've watched it, Canada doesn't tip in the same way, and yet that doesn't mean that we're not just as susceptible to the hype. We've seen lots that sometimes we're well behind. So, and I think some of the backswings that are happening were a bit behind. But I think, that doesn't mean that we're not seeing a great deal of kind of the way in which some of this paper started for me thinking about the ways that lots of the things that that you never say, right? All of those people, racist, homophobic, misogynist things that lots of people, even people that want to say those things, they don't say them. Trump gave them permission to say them, right? And so that's what really got me thinking about this, is what, like, that in itself is a tip right there. He tipped that, right? Tipping points are neither good nor bad. It's the ways in which they're mobilized in our societies. And so I guess I'm not entirely sure I'm answering your question, but we have lots of those that take place in Canada. And so I think that tip of voicing things that otherwise people are keeping to themselves, that has also occurred. We see that. And in some ways, it's terrible to hear that awful stuff that people are saying, but it's also revealing to us that it has been there all along, whether in the States, whether in Canada. And so naming it gives those of us trying to figure out how to deconstruct and change and transform, it actually gives us more honesty in some ways.
Yes, very, very insightful, Rachel. I'm going to read to you a comment from one of our audience members, Heather Katai. Thank you for your message, Rachel. Your stories help with an understanding of the larger social issue. I'm wondering about your thoughts about women with disabilities, whom we know are at least 40% more likely to experience violence, and how that is further complicated by other intersecting identities that they may have.
Yes, thank you, Heather. That one, there's a whole discussion around the ways in which bodily containment is used precisely as a tool of misogyny, sexism, patriarchy, and that more than anything, the limiting of the subject to the body and not to movement, time, ability to change things. That's something that really lands within disability politics. And so that's that. I've explored it a little bit with some colleagues, Danielle Piers and Lindsay Eales both from Edmonton. They're both some incredible disability scholars, feminist disability scholars. And we explored how movement, right, really, because I'm not saying that we stop talking about the body, not at all. I'm not saying that we stop talking about space in my obsession with time. What it is that we want to bring these things together and recognize that there actually is no difference between space and time, but they have been used to circumscribe primarily feminine bodies in ways that space has been used to circumscribe primarily feminine bodies in ways that time has been used temporality, the mind, rationality has been used to propel masculinity and patriarchy. So huge intersections there. I would love to talk to you more about that, Heather.
We have another observation and a question here from Marilyn Portress, whose presentation you mentioned in your remarks, Rachel. Marilyn says, I love the lens of the power of language and labels, and I feel the same about racism versus white supremacy. Can you talk about the way that you see that we can make things, or that we do make things palatable?
Yeah. I touched on it. Yes, I completely agree with that. And I touched on it very briefly at the end there. And knew that it was, as I was writing it and that I was just working on the other day, I knew that I wanted to dig into it more, which is the way that we use gender-based violence. Right now, it's a term that we use regularly. It's coming more into context. It's the subject of grants, as I talked about. But gender-based violence does something different in the body, in the mind, than misogyny does, just as sexism is something different than misogyny. In saying that, by using misogyny, making it more public, it will also change the power of that term. And so the answer, we will forever be creating new terms, but the terms that we use we have a responsibility to them. And when we make things palatable, I think that we take the sting out of the term, and we need that sting. We really do. We need to say white supremacy. We need to say misogyny. We need to say transphobia instead of or homophobia instead of homonegativity, right? They do respond to different things that are operating in our society, but we need to say the words that make people uncomfortable, because that's exactly what sparks, whether it sparks anger or that moment of, oh, right, I feel that more. Both of those are important steps towards our undoing of not the concepts, but their impacts on the worlds in which we live.
Thank you for your responses to those questions, Rachel. And I think I'll just invite us to move towards wrapping this up, since we're approaching 1 o'clock. It's a conversation which I know that all of us want to continue having. And again, getting back to the idea of tipping points and the timing of your lecture within the week of Madam Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and the uprising in dialogue again in the last few days about these and other human rights issues. I think that we're hoping that in the same way that this is the beginning of a conversation that we'll continue to invest in, amongst and with each other. I see there's a couple of other observations in the chat. So, and a really insightful question. I'll note that, and maybe we can keep this open for a little bit longer for any other questions to come in, and to give you a chance to respond in the chat if you'd like, Rachel. But for the moment, I think I'll proceed to wrap up for today. And thank you for your patience with the things that we've had to sort our way through in the last hour, and your graceful and passionate presentation, despite all those wranglings that we had to go through. So thank you. Welcome to the law school, and we'll look forward to posting this presentation in the days to come, and to keep all of you on this call engaged in the dialogue. So thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So with that, we will we will just go to wrapping this up. And if anyone has follow-up, again, they can put it in the chat, or if you'd like to reach out to Rachel directly, we can put Rachel's contact information in there. Katie, I wonder if you could do that, load Rachel's email address into the chat. Thank you, so that folks can follow up directly as well. And thanks.